Well, hey, everybody, welcome back to So You Want to Be in Ministry. I'm Tim, and we are all about educating you if you're thinking about jumping into ministry, equipping you if you're already in, encouraging you if you're considering jumping out of ministry, and then we want to empower you to follow godly leaders well. And we have a pretty incredible interview today with Mat Kountz. He is with Reaching and Teaching Ministries. He has heavily worked, he has worked in Central Africa and some of those places. He's also his main focus in his ministry has been in Ecuador, and he heavily focuses on Latin America and Spanish-speaking countries. And as you're going to hear, this is going to actually be something that comes up in the next few episodes, but you're going to hear him talk about the benefits that they received and how God used COVID to really radically shift their ministry in a very positive way. So it was so much fun talking to Mat. I'm looking forward to this. Let's get into this interview, and I'll see you on the other side of it. Well, hey, Mat, so glad to have you on the podcast today. Looking forward to this conversation. Excited about hearing about your ministry.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely, man. So you're with Reaching and Teaching Ministries. I want to just start off with you telling us a little bit about you. And I know you have a unique story of how you got to this place. So tell us a little bit about what you do and then how you got there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, for starters, about me, I am married to the lovely Amy, and we have 4 children, and they've been, part of this whole adventure with us. Amy and I both come from Wyoming, and were saved at later ages, not really from Christian households. So that affected it. I came out of atheism, and that's a whole other story, but my testimony is that a Gideon gave me a New Testament outside of my junior high school, and I thought it was a pocket dictionary, so I took it. And then when I found it was like an ancient religious text of some unknown religion, I was like, I'll read this. And it wasn't until I was 18 that through reading that New Testament and God opening up my eyes to sin, I became a Christian. So it is interesting. I'm very focused on the local church, but was saved outside of the local church. To be brought into it through that. And so I got saved around 18. My girlfriend at the time, who was my current wife, she was getting influenced by a bunch of college girls, and they were getting us into a college ministry, which was all about missions. And so I was a brand new Christian with no background in what Christianity was. And I read all the texts about missions, and I thought that they were being honest, that we should all do that. And so I was really like, okay, I need to get involved in this because that's what Christians do, just from, reading what Jesus was talking about. And so we got involved with some short-term trips as soon as we could, to mission trips. We went to Zambia working with an orphanage. And long story short, I decided that we should move over there and help this orphanage. I was running a business in Wyoming, and it was fairly successful. This orphanage was relying on United States funds to operate. So I said, why don't we just make a business over there that they can do to be able to fund themselves? And so my wife and I, we got married, and we prepared to move there. We got pregnant with our son, and when he turned 6 months old, we got our visa to be able to move to Zambia. So when he was 6 months old, we moved to Zambia. Our goal was to get an orphanage, kind of self-sustaining there. I call this our time of missiological failure repeatedly. It was before When Helping Hurts was written, but we saw everything about When Helping Hurts in there. We saw trying to help an orphanage become self-sustaining and it not wanting to, because that would affect giving from America. But it was really impactful on other levels, because I went there to help with business, having no preaching, teaching skills at all. And my Zambian boss, great fella, he's like, you're a missionary. You should be doing mission stuff. And that's something always to remember. They assume on the mission field, if you spend all that money to fly over there, you're probably good at doing mission stuff. You're a great preacher, a great teacher. So remember that when you put your youth up there to preach and they're heretics, that the people who are receiving that message say, these guys are the best of the best. Otherwise, they wouldn't spend thousands of dollars to ship them to our country to teach us. But he put me in the role of preaching like 3 days after I arrived. I'd never preached a sermon. It was probably awful. And then a month later, he says, hey, there's a building out here that we just put up for a school in the community, and we're going to plant a church there. And I was like, oh, that's really cool that you guys are doing it. He's like, yeah, you're going to be the pastor and you're going to plant it. And I was like, oh my goodness. But I was too naive I didn't know enough to say no. As you get older, you can say, I'm not the guy for that job. But I was just very young and jumped right into it. And I had 2 systematic theologies that people had given me as gifts before we went there. So I was reading those every day, trying to just not be a heretic, and working on that. And it was about 2 months after that, I'm working on that church, that my pastor, Bachanda, my boss, was like, hey, I've planted some churches in Congo and the theology there is terrible. And they're spreading, they're planting more churches, but we really need to get this under control. So why don't we go and teach a pastor's conference? And at the time I was saying, I don't know how to be a pastor. Why would I teach a pastor's conference? This makes no sense. But again, I was too naive to say, hey, I shouldn't do that. So I went with him to Congo, loved it, met all these pastors. Some of them had been pastoring. One pastor had been pastoring longer than I had been alive. Yeah. And he pulls me aside, and they can't tell how old I am because they told me all you white people look the same. So they didn't know what age I was. And he asked me, hey, I have a question. If I were to eat my enemy, would I get his sins? And I said, don't eat people. Like that shouldn't even, the side consideration shouldn't be there. Let's not be a cannibal. He's like, oh no, that's probably an important consideration. What I found out is these pastors, they've been pastoring for a long time, but they didn't read. So if they had the Bible in their language, which most of them didn't, they couldn't read it. And so a lot of these answers to these questions just weren't available. So I loved being there helping them. I went to a church plant, and the pastor afterwards, he let me preach. And afterwards, he invited me to come meet his family and said, hey, here's my wife. And I was like, oh, it's great to meet you. And he said, here's my second wife. And I was like, oh, nice to meet you. Oh, and here's my third wife. And went down the line. And he was not a bad guy, because we pulled him aside and we're like, have you looked at the pastoral epistles, like these qualifications of a pastor? You should be a one-woman man. And his response wasn't angry. It wasn't anything bad. He said, I didn't know. Yeah. And that was what we encountered repeatedly, is they didn't know. And so my heart really got broke for that. We went down to start a banana plantation, businesses for an orphanage, but ended up getting more into the ministry of the word and loving it. And even more so strategically, because we would go to Congo and we'd teach in like Swahili or French, but they would go off and teach in Luba and Seba and Tabwa and a bunch of languages that we don't speak, because most of the world speaks multiple languages. So I saw how beneficial it'd be to get into a trade language and train people who know local tribal languages, specifically those who don't read. So we're getting to where I am right now, but that made us move back to the United States to get trained so we could focus on training leaders. We wanted to move back to Congo and start a Bible college. And we went back to the United States, went to seminary. We wanted to have a theological education, a missions board, and a team, because we didn't have any of those things when we first went. So we went back looking for those things. And there was only a couple missions agencies that were planting seminaries, and Reaching and Teaching was a brand new one, and it was Baptist, and we were more Baptist. So we were like, this is what we're going to do. But they were scared to send us to Congo because they didn't know anything about Congo yet. But they're pretty established in South America, and they said, we're looking to form a team in Ecuador. And I went down on a trip just to see how the situation is. Very similar situation with pastors who can't read or don't have resources if they can read, and they need a lot of training. And I said, sure, that's a great route. So we packed up. At this point in time, we have all 4 of our children. So we only had 1 child in Zambia. We had 3 more after we came back while I was getting theological training. Then we went back to Ecuador, and that was like 9 years ago, and started working on a seminary there after learning the language.
How did your children respond? So, they had some of America, and then they went to Latin America. What was that dynamic on the kids' side of things?
Yeah, so that's always a really interesting dynamic. Our firstborn had spent time out of the United States as a youngin', and he's got that kind of missionary blood in him where he just wants to be bouncing around. So we thought that it would be really easy for him. But he actually had the hardest time going to Ecuador. He was 7 at the time, I believe, and he was just old enough to really realize it. And I remember talking to him, and we homeschooled, and he said, when we got there and we're pulling out books, he's like, I thought when I came here, my homeschooling would be like spear hunting and stuff like that. Why is this going on? And so he struggled with it, but everybody else was so young that they just slid into it. And that's why a lot of missions agencies will not have you take older kids, because they do struggle with it more. But he is the one right now who is really thinking internationally and probably wants to be a missionary when he's older. And so it's really, honestly, we just recently moved to the United States from Ecuador because of seminary stuff. And most of our kids don't understand the United States, because they've spent, all of them, except for him, have spent more time in Ecuador than the United States. So most of their life is, the United States is something pretty foreign. And even right now, it's not been a year, but it's been a good chunk of time, and they're still really trying to get used to the U.S.
Yeah. Thanks for handling that rabbit trail. I just think that's important, because if you do have children and you are thinking about mission field, that is something you probably are processing, and if you're not, you definitely need to be processing. Okay, so you go down to help out with this seminary. Where do we go from there?
Yeah, so in Ecuador, I came down in, honestly, before I got down there was a guy who was down there who, when you're starting a seminary, there's these little side things you have to have in mind. Like, we need people with doctorates. We need people who are good at training people. So when I went to the introduction to the agency, there was another guy who was working on a doctorate. I was about to start a doctorate, and I was really saying, hey, I've got the seminary plan. You need to join me. And he was all on board. And so he came down like a month after we did. We did language school together. There was another guy there who didn't have a doctorate and wasn't much interested in it. But then we kind of really pressured him to do that to help us with the seminary. And then another guy joined the team like afterward. We didn't really know him, but he was also working on a doctorate. So we had these 4 doctoral level guys, and everybody agreed to at least help to some level in planting the seminary. So we learned the language, which is key. If you want to do anything with people who speak a different language, learn their language. So we spent a good amount of time learning the language, and then just started classes with the 4 of us. As people were out of the country, we would, cycle in other teachers. So we had those 4 guys. But the mission field is crazy. So by year 1 of the guys disappeared. And then COVID came. So we replaced that guy with another guy. The guy who disappeared, we had another guy. COVID came. We lost 2 of our teammates. They went back to the United States. And that COVID was big for people in the United States going on the mission field and people on the mission field going to the United States. So that was 2020. And we lost those 2. And 1 stayed, but he kind of dropped out of working with the seminary. So it was just me. But the nice thing is, when COVID came, also the government shut our school down. So they said, no longer meeting in person. And I said to the teachers I had at the time, hey guys, let's go ahead and start doing this online so that we can not miss ground and still finish the semester when they let us open up in a couple weeks. And what happened was they let us open up like 2.5 years later.
Yeah.
We just kept waiting. We kept going online and kept waiting. And then by the time we could open up, within about 7-8 months, we had doubled our student body online, but they weren't in our town where our seminary was. And then that kept happening. We're double about every year our student body, but it kept spreading out where it was. So by the time they let us open back up our school, we decided not to open it up for in-person training, but to focus on this online school. But because in-person training is so helpful, we started planting these little study centers. We call them satellite schools around, where the students can gather. If there's 10, 15, 20 of them, they can all gather together in a church and study together. So it's like online, but they do their work together. And that's actually why we moved to the United States, is because Ecuador wasn't the center of our mission work. And it's a lot cheaper to go everywhere in the world from the United States than it is from Ecuador.
Yeah. So are your satellites or online, are you only seeing like Latin America? Are you seeing other places or?
Yeah. So we do, we do the Spanish language. So that actually spreads around. We have people in about 12 different countries in Latin America, but we also have some students in Spain, in Italy, and in the United States, just Spanish speakers. And then one of our students for a long time, he's been there ever since the first days of the in-person seminary way back in the day, is Haitian Creole. And he really wanted to get training back to his people. So we've been working on a translation project, and we're now training students in Haitian Creole through him really running it. Though now that we have more students, we're going to try to expand that workforce. But his name's Frankie, and he's been a workhorse for us for a long time. But yeah, we do that. One time, what happened, another thing is kind of a side note. When 2020 hit and I ran out of teachers and everybody disappeared, I was online. So I realized I don't have to have teachers who are in Ecuador. And so I was able to reach out and grab great teachers from all over the world, got them from Argentina, from Mexico, from the United States. But then I found this teacher in Spain. He heads up Simeon Trust in the Spanish language. And I was like, hey, I would love to talk to the Simeon Trust guys about helping our seminary do a preaching certificate. And he was a really great guy. He was planting a church, him and his brother. And they were doing an internship with church planters. And because I ran the seminary online, I could work in different contexts. So he asked if I'd come and train them for like they do mini modules for a couple months in Spain. And I was able to train those church planters in Spain while I was running the seminary. And it was actually a test field for me too, to see how running the seminary from somewhere else would function. Because I still have a team of workers in Ecuador, and I wanted to know, like, if I'm not there, how does everything work? And so that got me connected with Spain, which there's all these side things. And I don't talk too much about my future plans because they tend not to work out. I usually tell people about what already happened.
Yeah, hey, that sounds like ministry.
Yes. Yeah, no, that's been like my thing is I try 9 things and 8 of them fail, but that one that doesn't, it's great. And I really enjoy it. But when I was in Spain, the connection with the Arabic world in Spain is so strong, and the access is so easy. And I really hope to get into the Arabic world in the future. And you have some people that might have some security issues when they talk about this stuff, but I am on the internet so heavily, at least in the Spanish language, teaching people and doing things that I will never be able to get a visa into these countries, but we might be able to resource them. And, sneak in the back gate, especially through Spain and France, which is a great way to work with the North African world.
Yeah, COVID was such a just awkward, weird time, especially in the U.S. as the church. I mean, it was worldwide, but it was just weird and awkward. And I love hearing that in that weirdness and awkwardness and difficulty and trying to figure out how to do things differently, God really used it, and God really blessed that it opened the doors for you to go way beyond Ecuador, to see where all this could go. That the border right now is language more than its location, which is really cool.
Yeah, and the wild thing about COVID as well is that people who didn't deal with technology around the world had to, because shutdowns around the world were so much different than the United States. The United States is so free, and a lot of people don't realize that. So in Ecuador and Peru, like in Peru, they had tanks in the streets. They were like, you are not leaving your home. In Ecuador, they would arrest you for being on your front lawn. And so people were stuck in their house so much that we found tribal people learning how to use the internet. And I'd get like a Cañari guy, which is a tribal group in the mountains of Ecuador, saying, hey, you want to join our Facebook Bible study that we're starting here? And I'm like, wow, that's really cool. So that helped us at the same time when we're forced to be online. And then everybody who doesn't know how to do it now knows how to manage all that stuff. It really opened a lot of doors for us.
Yeah, it sounds like it. That is awesome. I love that story, how you landed there. So talk to us a little bit about how some of this fleshes out day to day for you, or maybe month to month as you do your training.
Yeah, so that's super boring. I prepare and teach classes. I organize students. I've got a team working at my seminary. They do a lot of grading and background work for me. So some of the boring stuff has been able to be handed off to some of my team, but I organize teachers to be able to come in. Right now, I'm trying to organize a student ministry teacher and a women's ministry teacher to join our seminary. And so I guess I have the role of a president, which is one of the more boring roles. I think Al Mohler said, you don't need a president every day, but when you do need them, you really need them. And I feel that like a lot of my stuff is trying to advance where we're at student-wise and where we're at teacher-wise and make sure that we're giving quality education. The joy, like the glory of our ministry is in the students.
Well, I do want to hear a couple of those student stories, since those are the interesting areas. So do you have like one or two that maybe stick out?
Yeah, well, there's always a ton that stick out, but the reason that I'm in this is because the students do ministry better than I do. The reason I would to some degree, much rather be doing the adventurous things that they get to do. But they are so much better at it. For example, I work with some people groups down in the southern jungles of Ecuador, the Shuar and the Achuar. And those are two distinct languages, though they can kind of understand each other. The Shuar are 0.5% evangelical, and the Achuar are 1% evangelical. And they're jungle people. They are really separated. They're famous. If you've ever seen Shrunken Heads, the Sansa, they're people who did that. And there's still a lot of that type of stuff going on. The awesome thing is a good chunk of them speak Spanish. And so there are people who are Christians, they speak Spanish, and I can train them, and they can go off and plant churches in fields that are so difficult for people like me to get into, because I have to learn Spanish, which is a trade language, then learn Achuar, and then spend about 10 or 15 years learning the culture so I'm not super offensive. Then I can start sharing the gospel, and then I can start working on forming a church. Whereas they already know the culture, they know the language, they're just low on theology. So I can come in and help them there. And I remember working with a church planter. His name's Guillermo, and we're in the jungle walking through just complete green. It's all jungle plants. Like there's no clear distinction between anything. And he slaps me on the chest. And he's like, "What are you doing?" And I say, "I don't know what I'm doing." He's like, "You're in that guy's garden." And so he has eyes that I don't know how I could form, as this American guy going to live in the jungle. He's walking barefoot, hanging out with people. He knows all the little things that offend and don't offend that would take me decades to pick up. And because I'm a Christian, there's areas in that tribe where they're gracious with me, because they're like, "Hey, you don't get our culture, but we love you because we're united in Christ." And so I can work with them, and they can be trained in evangelism and the gospel and in doctrine. And then they can go out and plant churches, and we'll see them do that. And I'm not just looking for speed, but it is much quicker because you're cutting back on unneeded work. They already know the culture. They already know the language, so they can do it a lot quicker. So I love that. I love the different language groups we can work with. And like I said, in Zambia, that was the thing that really broke my heart as we're training those Congolese pastors is I will never speak Tabwa. I will never speak Seba. But right now, this teaching that we're giving is going to go out into Seba. It's going to go out into Tabwa. It's going to go out into Lingale. In these languages that I'll never be able to affect, they can. So my big thing is I just want to help them be as effective as they possibly can be, because they're the hands and feet out there doing the work.
So, I mean, you're talking about heavily unreached people groups is what I'm grasping here. Can you give us some of the dynamics? You did right there for a little bit, but give us some of the dynamics of being able to minister to unreached people groups, and maybe even how pastors here in the U.S., or pastors sitting at home, or even church people at home, how we can partner to help this happen.
Yeah, I mean, unreached people groups, it's a funny thing because we have all these numbers on them, but what we really want to make sure happens is people who don't have access to the gospel get access to the gospel. There's some ways of counting out there where if somebody has access to a false gospel, it counts, and they're considered reached. So we always want to investigate, do these people have access to the real gospel? Because it's interesting, the Japanese of Japan are, I think, the second largest unreached people group. They're 3 times as evangelical as the Shuar of Ecuador. but the Shuar are considered reached on a lot of maps because they're like 7% Catholic. And the interesting thing is the Catholics there actually persecuting pretty heavily the evangelical church. They'll burn their churches down or beat them or imprison them. And really, the thing we need to look at is not, are they Muslim, Catholic, Orthodox, whatever. We need to say, what do these people believe? And do they have access to the truth, to the gospel? That's why, the evangelical number is so important when you're looking at these, is do they have access to the evangel? And they're all over the place. They tend to be unreached because they're hard to get to. They're in a jungle, or they're hard to get to because their culture or their government doesn't like Christianity. And that's part of why Japan has been such a heavy or hard mission field for a long time. That's why China used to be such a problem. Why areas of the Middle East are a problem to get into is because the culture is saying, hey, we don't want this message around here. And then we look bad on the world scene. So as we are walking around all white and carrying a blue passport, that has effects. And when I walk into a foreign country, they assume I'm Christian. So I've already got that sign on my back. They assume that everything that is in Hollywood is what I'm about as well, because they relate MTV and Hollywood and Christianity are all the same thing in a lot of their minds. And that's an interesting thing too, because we can send missionaries from South America to these Muslim countries, and they'll openly be Christian, and they'll be like, yeah, well, they're Latinos. I mean, of course they're Christian. And a lot of what the Muslim world doesn't like is the worldliness of the United States, but it's linked with Christianity in our mind, in their mind. And so Latinos can go and reach the world really well because of the color of their skin, because of their government. And they're like, of course, I mean, they're Catholic. They're going to try to get us to become Catholic. And you asked me a question that wasn't that. You asked, how can we be involved in this?
No,
big,
we need to we need to understand, especially American Christians and maybe American pastors. We need to understand what you just said. It is not common knowledge, I don't think. That is misunderstood. Where too often I think we view ourselves as the saviors of the world instead of understanding that Jesus is the savior of the world. And he has tons of ways that he can reach people for Jesus. And how we're viewed can actually prevent that at times.
Yeah. No, it really is quite the hindrance, especially in today's culture, because America is exporting things that are just detestable to a lot of the world. I was in Zambia when Barack Obama took office, and crazy thing that happened, there was malaria clinics funded by the United States all over the place. Overnight, they turned into abortion mills immediately. And we say we have laws in place to where we can't export that, but we do. All you have to do is, I'm giving you this money. I'm not going to say you have to do this, but if you don't, I won't give you money. And like, it's really easy. Countries know if we want American funds, we need to set up abortion. And most of the world finds that utterly detestable. And so we have this bad name all over the place that a lot of other countries don't. And especially with pioneering work, if you're just trying to step into a door of a place, it has a lot to do with how offensive you are. You know, how difficult to talk to you are. The evangelists tend to be the more winsome people. If you are super mean and people don't like to be around you because you seem dirty, then it's hard to evangelize. And that's what a lot of missionaries come across as: super mean just because they're Americans. Like, you are against everything I love. You're against Muhammad. You're against truth. You're against the 10 Commandments because you're American. And you're ceremonially unclean to a high degree because you're American. That's before we even open our mouth or take a step towards somebody. And that's why local leaders do so well in those roles, because they aren't immediately seen as unclean. When they start talking about Jesus being more than a prophet, they're going to start to seem suspect. But you have to go down those roads. The nice thing is they'll at least get a hearing before they're rejected.
All right. How do we help as people in churches? How do we engage? Help is the wrong word. How do we engage? So, I mean, it could be, the answer could be as simple as prayer, but if there's more than that, or I should even say less than that, prayer is the most important. But if there is other things besides just simply praying for these areas, praying for missionaries, like you praying for seminaries and people in these seminaries, what else can we partner with?
Yeah, obviously praying, giving, these are foundational. Sending well, send your best and think about how you're sending. When you do send, engage with locals who are there, even in most of the most unreached people groups. There's a couple Christians. Help those guys. There's this idea where you want to stay away from them because you want to go from 0 to 1. But there's another concept where you can go from 1 to 100 with about the same difficulty. So find the church that exists and work with them the best that you can. If they're utterly heretical, know that most of them in the world are. A lot of the churches in the United States are heretical, and a lot of them don't want to stay that way. And so you just work with them, be like, hey, does the Bible teach that? And you're like, oh, no, like we see that with you, and you just work them up. And then you have this healthy church that's indigenous and it's local, and they can go off and do that stuff. So think about the local believers that exist. Think about sending well. If you have somebody that you don't trust to do ministry in your church, don't send them to the mission field. Send people who you're going to hurt to lose. And like they did with Paul and Barnabas in the Bible. And they said, we're going to send Paul. I mean, just the best. I mean, people might argue with you, but that guy's just one of the best. And so think about those type of things. Obviously praying, obviously giving. Try to get to know what you're giving to, what you're praying about, what you're serving. Because if you are helping people who are out spreading the prosperity gospel, stop. There's no shame in telling the deacon's cousin that he gets no more support because he's preaching Benny Hinn. Like, just if they're preaching a different gospel, cut them off. That's something that I am not ashamed to say, and it's really hard in church circles to hear that. But I would encourage you, as somebody nobody knows, to go ahead and do that.
Yeah, absolutely, man. You and me both. Since we're on this topic, why don't you let people know? I try to do this every time we have somebody who does earn income off of support. I want to give you an opportunity to tell people where to find how to support you. And so if you're out there and you're like, man, I love what I'm hearing, I want to be a part financially of helping this happen, where can they go to be a part of that for you, Matt?
Yeah, thank you for that. If you go to rtim.org, that's Reaching and Teaching International Ministries, rtim.org, and you go to the missionaries section, we'll be one of those missionaries under there, Matthew and Amy Kountz, and you can go under there and there's a link to give to us. Or I don't know if you have show notes in this podcast, but I can send a link that you could put inside of the show notes as well.
Absolutely.
I'll give a link to our update newsletter as well. So if people want to get video updates, we send them out about once a month, and we can do it that way. But there's a lot of other people too that are worth giving on that sheet as well. So you'll find them.
Yeah. And you also do a blog post on there, correct? I saw some sort of blogging on there.
Oh yeah. Reaching and Teaching has a blog.
Okay.
I should know about this better than I do. But yeah, there's a blog. I think I've written a couple of articles on there. There's a bunch of people who have. It's actually really solid stuff. Reaching and Teaching also has a podcast with 9 Marks Ministry, the missions podcast. No, that's a different Good Missions podcast. Global Missions podcast, I think, is Reaching and Teachings. But you can look it up. It's linked with all the 9 Marks podcasts. And I don't run a blog myself, but we do. We keep up to date with video communications about what we're doing.
Yeah. With that, is there one, maybe 2 books, if people were just like, I want to understand this more, I want to understand the world more, I want to understand overseas ministry more, is there 1 or 2 books that you would recommend people just get into and read for themselves?
It's hard. There's an introduction to global missions by Zane Pratt's I think the first name on there. There's a couple other authors on there. That's a really helpful book. There's a book that I think is out of print. The author had some issues, but it's called Reaching and Teaching. And it talks a lot about the state of the global church. There's so much, and it's constantly changing. My big thing when you want to know about something is find your people. If your church already has missionaries, find out where they are and get to know from them, like things that will help your heart, help your understanding with the people they're working with. Because a friend of mine just started leading a missions agency recently, and he's trying to keep his head wrapped around the entire world. And it's impossible. It's so different, so diverse around there. And my thought is, if you want to really pray well, give well, send well, specialize. Stay in a small area, work with those that you're already kind of working with, and get to know them really well.
So one of the aspects of our podcast is to be a place where those pastors, those in ministry that would be having a difficult time, just a difficult season, tough season, that they could find some encouragement. So is there any encouragement that you would give to somebody that is having a difficult season and is maybe even considering just jumping out of ministry just because it feels like it's hopeless, or it's just never ending, or they're discouraged or anything like that?
Well, yeah, I'll probably have a pile of different things. So for starters, the great news is God doesn't need us in any of this work. So it's not hopeless. And a lot of the times we're discouraged is because we think to some level it's relying on us, and it's not relying on us. So our failures are not God's failures, and he ends up just fine. He always looks good in this story, contrasted to our badness. So that is going to be okay. And also I can say through my own experience, I have failed so much, and those failures have made me who I am today, which is slightly better than the guy who was failing. And I'm always getting slightly better at what I'm doing, so my ministry might be more effective. But as I look back at those failures, they're never as big as I thought they were at the time. They're never as terrible as I thought they were at the time. All the things that I lost, all the difficulties weren't as difficult as I thought they were at the time. And it's only been 20 years since I started doing mission work, or even less than that. And imagine what that'll look like in 10,000 years when you're looking back at your life of ministry and saying, oh, these giant failures were tiny. The big thing is just be faithful. And being faithful doesn't mean that we are leading things up. It doesn't mean that we keep an official role. So some people do need to pop out of ministry for a while. And there's no shame in that. Some people need to pop out of ministry for a long while. I just read a book recently where a guy was saying, if you think that your church can't handle things without you, die. And you'll see that they will. As soon as you die, they'll replace you and they'll be fine. And the fact is, like, everything is fine without us. And the most important people in history, like huge, important presidents of countries, we don't know who they are. And that's only a couple hundred years ago. Like, you can't name the person who was president 150 years ago. And they won't be able to name us. And that's okay, because the focus is God. And he gets the glory in all of this through our failures and our successes. Obviously, we want to succeed. But I don't know if that was actually encouraging or just mumbling.
I was encouraged. I think I would say this. It is encouraging because it's refreshing. We have to be reminded. I have to be reminded that it is not dependent on me. The world does not revolve around me. We all fail. I think that's something that we're like, oh, see, I'm a failure. Like, I did it again. And it's like, yeah, me too. Like, last week, like, it's recent. Like, and I think when we are very open about confessing that we do these things, we go through these seasons, and it's all in a weird way normalized, it becomes refreshing and it becomes encouraging, where it's like, yeah, man, I'm in that too. Like, I have that. The other thing, you said this, and I've had a few come on and say this. It's okay to step away in seasons. Like, we often, like, I think God is not going like, yeah, how dare you go get a different job for a little bit. Like, you can be faithful being an incredible follower of Jesus, doing a whole lot of things. So I've never understood that either.
Yeah, and throughout history, a lot of the people, the movers and shakers, were not the professional ministers. I mean, really, the thing is, are you getting paid for it? Because we're, as Christians, supposed to be ministering to people all the time. And when we look at, like, Peter and Paul, some of our big, heroes in the Bible, were big failures, and they intentionally wrote about it. Like, even Mark, who wrote the book of Mark, pretty sure he's the guy who ran away naked from Jesus. They took his towel, so he had to run away naked. I think he put it in there just to be like, hey guys, we fail. and now I'm writing scripture. And you never know where God's going to take you after your failures. But there's a difference between Judas and Peter with how they handled their failures. And one repented, one didn't. Repentance is the right response, but repentance doesn't mean, oh, now I'm going to give up on everything. It means, I reject the sin in my failure, and I'm going to keep going forward.
Yeah. I recently had a guest that said he thinks repentance is critical to going the distance and finishing well, that you have to have repentance. Yeah,
it's the foundation of the Christian life. I think that was the first of the 95 theses. All of life is repentance, and it's without repentance we're not gospel people. Like, to be a gospel person, we're constantly seeing our wrong. We're constantly admitting that, we're bringing that to Christ, and we're being forgiven repeatedly, 70 times, 7 times every day, and that's what kind of God we serve. That's the kind of people he uses, are the Peters and the Pauls, the Marks.
Yeah, and go down the list. Yeah, I recently read it was a book by a South Korean Christian, and he talked about how the fact that we like to go to Hebrews 11 to talk about the heroes of the faith, and he's like, he goes, it could easily be called the failures of the faith as well, because
there's some real mongrels.
Yeah, person after person, you're just like, they did what? Like, so he's like, yeah, I mean, we like to, because it was the hero in their life, which is Jesus. So I thought that was really cool how he kind of brought those dynamics out. Cool, man. Any last words for us?
No, I appreciate you, having me on. If people are interested in thinking about talking about missions, maybe going on the mission field, I'll give Tim my contact info, and you guys can get in contact with me. I would love to talk to you more about it, because it's something to think through and prepare for before you go off and do it.
Yep, we'll get that out on social media, show notes, all that stuff. So just look into the descriptions of all these places, and you'll be able to get those things. Matt, thank you so much for being here. It was so fun talking to you and just hearing your story and what God's doing through you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
One thing that I have enjoyed in doing this podcast for about 1.5 years now is the fact that people that I know that I've been connected to that have come on and done these interviews are now connecting me to other people that I didn't know about. Matt is one of those. And it is fun to just hear their heartbeat for Jesus, to hear their heartbeat to equip people to do the ministry that God called them to do. I am so glad God connected Matt into this podcast, and just to me. He was a fun interview. It's going to be fun seeing where God takes their ministry. If you do want to lean in and support them, or maybe some Spanish-speaking pastors or churches or places that could benefit from the training that they provide, connect them. Connect Matt, like he's on Facebook. It's Reaching and Teaching Ministries. We'll put all the links in the descriptions. Please check it out. He would be more than happy to connect that, as he already told you. So use this resource, utilize it to the best of your ability. He would love to be part of resourcing you and benefiting so many more in the Latin community. So make sure you check that out. Thank you so much for checking this out. If you haven't taken the time to follow or subscribe or like, if you're watching on YouTube, just to hit the like button, it really helps in the algorithm. That may seem nonsensical. It may seem like a tedious thing that doesn't really matter. It makes a big difference in helping this channel and this podcast reach a larger audience. And I am trying to get out there because I just want to be a benefit. I want to be a value to other people. And God is doing some cool things. I'm hearing back from you. God is doing some cool things, but I'd love to make the reach even farther and wider if possible, and Lord willing. But if you could be a part of that and just be a servant and do some of that, if you really are enjoying what you're hearing and benefiting from it, I would really appreciate it too. Thank you so much if you've already done that. Thank you so much for those of you that are champions of this ministry. It is incredibly encouraging to me, and I'm so grateful for you. I'll see you in the next episode. Looking forward to it. We're going to have a fun summer with some of the episodes we have coming up, and I look forward to it. See you then.